Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Lead Different podcast premiere for our interview with Paul McCarthy. Hey, Paul, thanks so much for being here. I know we're quite a few hours time difference, but it's so good to have you back. I couldn't wait to get this podcast out, and so for those of you that are joining us live, I'm looking forward to sharing Paul's thoughts on leadership and fired leadership specifically. So, Paul, welcome. How are you doing?
Thank you.
How
Yeah,
have you been?
it's good. Oh, I think we've got a bit of a technical glitch on my side. Okay, good. Can you hear me okay, Dan?
Yes, sir. How's it going this week?
Wonderful. It's going good. It's good. Yeah, lots going on, and I really enjoyed our conversation. So happy to be here again to chat and explore what we explore.
Yeah, well, listen, give you an introduction to the format and those of you that are listening. So this podcast is going to go out on all our platforms. It's going to be on YouTube. It's going to be, this live is going on YouTube. It's on LinkedIn and it's on Facebook. So if you're joining us on any of those platforms, and as Paul has said, you've done a good job of letting your network know, Paul, hey, join us live, have some questions for us, ask us anything. So for the next half hour, as we play Paul's interview, Paul and I are also going to be interacting with you on LinkedIn here in the studio. If you make a comment on any of the platforms, we'll be able to see it. We'll feature you on the screen as the interview is going on. And if you have questions, we're going to try to answer them. This is something new that I'm trying, Paul. And of course, you know that I'm a guy who wants to challenge the status quo and do things different. So yes, the original podcast is going to go out on audio and video on Spotify and all the podcast platforms. But this is an opportunity for us to interact, and it hasn't yet taken off. We haven't had thousands of people chiming in, and I've seen those things happen. But we can always dream, and that's where we want to get to. And today's topic is so timely, Paul. I really enjoyed re-listening to the episode, and I think you guys are going to enjoy learning more about the qualities that we want for the leaders of the future. And that's really the topic we talked about. The other thing that I've been able to do is I was able to connect Paul with one of our previous guests, Dr. Holly White, who is a cognitive psychologist and does a lot of work on people who are considered attention different. Hey, there's Holly White chiming in. So let's feature her. She's saying chime, chime, chime. And Holly and I had a fantastic interview. If you guys get a chance, go back and look at that interview. And we talked about the strength of people who are attention different, right? Those of us who are attention different, not attention deficit. It's not attention, and it's not a deficit, and it's not a disorder. And if you listen to that interview, Holly does a great job of explaining what that is. So, Paul, anything exciting you've got going on? I know we're going to put some stuff in the show notes, how to find your book. I can't wait to get my copy. I know you're sending me one, but I know other people, they've got to go through Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Where else can they get your book?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I don't know if we mentioned it in our podcast, but it's just been shortlisted as one of the 8 leadership category finalists for the UK 2024 Business Book of the Year. And it's also been submitted to the Financial Times and Schroders Business Book of the Year 2024. So my publisher and I are working a deal for July and August. So if you're interested, anyone's interested in buying the book on the Kindle, like the Amazon version, you can get it for 99 cents, stroke 99 pence, and we can share the details, obviously, in the show notes. And one of the things I just wanted to do, because this is quite different and you're trying something different, I just thought I'd try something different before we start the interview and show people what we talked about. And I wanted to read, Dan, something from my book, if you allow me to. It's like a couple of seconds, really. And it really contextualizes really what my work is about in this saturated sea of thought leaders who work in the area of leadership, and I think it really is quite timely, as you mentioned. So I just want to read a paragraph, and then we can kind of get going with everything. Explaining the introduction to the book about fired leadership and what it's about and why now and what I'm doing. And I say, I quote this from the book: "Were this a conventional thought leadership book written by yet another self-styled leadership guru, this is the part where I'd introduce a new paradigm-shifting proprietary leadership theory based on hundreds of interviews and thousands of conversations with practitioners, academics, leaders, consultants, researchers, etc. This is not that book. And then I go in to talk about the essence of fired leadership, and it's quite groundbreaking and experiential, and it's a very different approach to the future of leadership, which is pretty counterintuitive. So just setting the context down for as we go into this conversation, this is a very different approach to the future of leadership than many thought leaders are espousing, and it's taken 5 years to get to this point where it's being accepted and integrated into the way that we're talking about the future. So I'm personally quite proud of what we've done so far, and there's lots more to do.
Well, one of the things that I love about the work that you're doing, Paul, is and you are breaking the mold and you are doing it differently. You can sign up and get the stuff that you have that's available for everybody to get. And it's, there you can go download the guide, you can download a lot of the materials because you truly care about getting this in the hands of leaders and changing the future of leadership. Now you can look, Paul doesn't work for free. You can still hire him and come and to come work with you. So there is that element of it, but that's not the whole point of inviting you to his website. There's a lot of free resources there, and I really appreciate that approach, Paul.
Yeah, and that, for me, it's about addressing the institutional and the systemic issues about leadership. And so for me, if I can give away a lot of material and I can open source the future of leadership so that you can do this yourselves in the organizations you're a part of, right? I've got a $3 million companion guide that I give away on my website. Give me your email. There'll be no spam, I promise. Download it, use it. Let me know how it works, because I don't want to covet my thought leadership. I want to make it accessible to all. And I want people to evolve it, because that's why I'm doing this, right? To evolve the conversations. Don't want to hoard my stuff. Don't want to, be proprietary in that sense. I want to give this stuff to the world, because really we need to do better. And this is my attempt to help do that.
And I think we can do better. And I know we will do better if we pay attention to the lessons that you share with us, Paul. So without any further ado, let's start the interview. And thank you, Holly, for joining us. Dr. Holly, look forward to interacting with you as the interview goes on. So with that being said, Sunil, I'll take us off screen and let's get
the podcast that redefines leadership and challenges the status quo. Yes. Founder and CEO of Why Not Leadership. This show is your compass to becoming a better leader through the power of self-awareness. Good leaders foster teams that are engaged, empowered, and energized. Join us on this transformative journey as we equip you with the tools and insights to lead different. Get ready to challenge the ordinary and embrace self-aware leadership. This is Lead Different.
Subscribe now. Discover a new era of leadership. Lead different, because great leaders change the world.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of the Lead Different podcast. Today, we have on our show Mr. Paul McCarthy. I cannot wait to tell you guys more about him. He is a seasoned leadership expert with 25 years of experience, having held multiple executive roles. Despite being fired from 4 different positions for embodying and advocating for the very leadership qualities he was hired for, Paul remains a vocal critic of the current leadership system. Can you understand why he's on the Lead Different podcast? Paul believes that organizations need leaders who exhibit disruptive and rebellious qualities to navigate ongoing disruptions successfully. By recruiting and training leaders in these counterintuitive qualities, organizations can retain future leaders longer and foster growth in leadership and organizational cultures. His approach is an evidence-based, experiential, and experimental method, meeting organizations at various stages of their leadership journey: awareness, awakening, addressing issues, embracing new methods, and embodying effective leadership. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to Paul McCarthy. How are you, Paul?
Dan, thank you for having me. Yes, I'm doing well. I know we had some chat backstage as well, so really pumped up for a conversation. I know it's going to be. I know, the title of a podcast called Lead Different, I think, is just in my bailiwick. So I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with someone who has a similar philosophy. So thank you.
Well, thank you for being on. I know, listen, you're in the UK, so it's a lot later for you than it is for me. We're starting our day. You're finishing your day. So we're excited that we were able to make our schedules work. and talk to you because listen, as I was reading that introduction, I might as well have been reading my own introduction because that is we come to life, we come at life in a very similar manner. And just a little while ago in the pre-show, we spent a bit of time going over your YOS results. And that was really fascinating for me because we share the why of challenge and the why of contribute in our why operating system. So for those of you that are listening, and Paul, we do this every show. We, a lot of our audience are coaches and consultants and people who are certified in the why discovery that use this in their coaching. So they always want to know, okay, what's the guest why operating system? So let me let you guys off the hook and tell you about Paul, but you probably know just from the introduction, his why is to challenge the status quo. His how is to find a better way and share it. And his what is to contribute to the success of others and make a positive impact. So, Paul, let's start with that since we literally just went over your results. What was that like for you hearing those results?
Yeah, I mean, words for me that are surfacing are it was validating. It reinforces why I've been in the environments that I've been, why and how I've behaved the way I have. I mean, I've always been motivated to think differently, act differently, do things differently. So for me, those, finding out those three areas are kind of affirming. And it's always good to have an objective outside influence to kind of confirm that. And so for me, yeah, I'm not shocked, not surprised at all, but I do think it's an interesting conversation to have with people who aren't motivated that way,
Right.
kind of help them understand why my why is my why, if that makes sense.
Right. That makes total sense, Paul. One of the things I want to talk about is your mission. We look at your mission, and your mission is to change the future of leadership by guiding others and discovering their new future. And you do that through supporting leaders and leadership teams to identify, recruit, onboard, and develop the types of leaders needed to help organizations prepare for the future of leadership. What types of leaders are those? And this is the Lead Different podcast. So, and you are a perfect example of somebody that leads differently. So, what are the types of leaders that we're going to need in our organizations to prepare for the future of leadership?
Yeah, and I think, well, straight off the bat, the types of leaders that we'll need will increasingly be required to think differently, and not just think differently, but to have the courage to think and act and dare to act differently. So, there's a lot of conversation globally at the moment about divergent thinking, divergent perspectives, and that extends way beyond the definition of how we've kind of couched that in the conversations we're having. It's about how we approach leadership. And I've been as you said in the introduction, I've been a vocal critic of leadership today. And what I mean by leadership today is the way we identify, recruit, onboard, and develop leaders. And I've shown with evidence and research and clear case studies that the way we've done it up until now hasn't worked. And so the next generation of leaders will want a different way to be identified, recruited, onboarded, and developed. So my work is really that bridge to help organizations to be able to attract and embrace and retain the leaders that we'll need for the future, because they're hiding in plain sight. The kinds of leaders that we marginalize and discredit and fire are often the leaders who have the leadership qualities that will increasingly be needed to navigate ongoing disruption. But we're not seeing those leadership qualities for the true essence of what they are, or the value down that they bring to organizations. So yeah, my mission is really to firstly simplify the process of the future leadership, but also to help organizations, hiring managers, VPs of HR, chief people officers, anyone in the industry of HR and leadership, to show why we will need different leadership qualities for the future.
Right. So what are some of those leadership qualities that we're going to need in the future? So and when we look at, so we talked about your mission and then when we talk about your passion, Your passion is to transform leadership by promoting disruptive and authentic qualities that foster healthy organizational cultures and challenge the status quo. We knew we were going to get that in there, but so what are those qualities those leaders need for in the future? What are we looking for, and how are we missing them? How are organizations missing and making the mistake, as we said, like you did? You were fired from 4 different positions for being that
Yeah.
disruptive leader. So tell us more about that. Let's start with that.
Yeah, because I think that is the platform that paves the conversation that I've been having for 5 years. So as a leader myself, yes, I was fired from 4 different senior leadership roles. And my story is very public. So anyone that knows my story or even Googles me will find out very quickly that I was hired over very long, protracted, expensive recruitment processes. So often
Right.
6 to 9 interviews on average, where I was demonstrate the leadership qualities that I was ultimately hired for. And as soon as I started to demonstrate them, Dan, I would become marginalized. I would have my wrists slapped, proverbially. I would be siloed in the organization, and I would get into trouble because what I was doing without my knowledge was I was stepping on what I would call ego-based leadership landmines. I was highlighting toxicity. I was highlighting the politics. And when I sat back after the 4th time I was fired, I spent some time to research the leadership industry, because as a consultant, my expertise was actually to help develop leaders. So I was at the forefront of the trends and the future trends and on the horizon for what leaders of the future would need to be characterized by. So I started to ask this very simple question, really, which was, I wonder if we're firing, overlooking, or marginalizing or discrediting leaders who have the very leadership qualities that we'll need to make our organizations future ready and navigate disruption successfully. And so though I aim to simplify. So what I was doing was looking at as many leadership programs, onboarding processes, hiring managers, approaches to leadership recruitment as I could. And I was starting to see what was missing. And so the things that started to be very clear to me, I started to think, well, why was I fired? And I became, I put together almost a matrix of all the reasons why I was fired. And certain words kept on surfacing: challenging the status quo, accountability, being real, expressive, not playing the political game, being transparent. And I started to cross-reference that with what was on the in terms of the trends and the research and for the future of leadership. I started to see that those things were missing from the way that we develop leaders in the programming that we have. And that's where Fired Leadership was born. And Fired Leadership is an acronym which, yeah, and there is a deliberate pun, which is saying you are firing the leaders with these qualities that you need to navigate ongoing disruption. And
Right.
F is fresh thinking. So in my why, we just talked about it. I think differently. I approach thinking in a different way. So fresh thinking is that ability to think differently. I is for the inquisitive nature. So a lot of research has been conducted by Professor Francesca Gino from Harvard, who talks about curiosity being critical to the future. Inquisitive nature is a similar concept to curiosity that Francesca talks about. R is for real and accountable. So we've talked and we've seen a lot of research about compassionate leadership, vulnerable leadership, authentic leadership. And there are so many different terms, but ultimately what it comes down to is being real as a leader in the workplace and being accountable to being real.
Right.
E is for the expressive and challenging. So again, challenging the status quo, being very vocal and professional, of course, in how you articulate your thoughts in an organization. And D is for direct and transparent. And for me, that's very much one of the most important ones, they're all important and they all interweave, but the D is really about not playing political games and being very clear with your intent behind the communication that you have and you make in an organization. So those 5 things, in fact, I think it was Marshall Goldsmith who actually, when he endorsed my book, one of the things he said, I think it was, in a landscape cluttered with complex theories about leadership, fired leadership simplifies and provides a profound way of simplifying the future of leadership. And for me, others have said, it's a leadership methodology that can fit on a post-it note, because I deliberately tried to simplify the process of leadership, because the future generation of leaders don't want the over-complex approach that we've had up until now either. So that's in a nutshell. So these 5 qualities are pretty much missing, downplayed, marginalized when displayed, and discredited as well when displayed in leaders today and leadership programming today.
You said a lot. I want to make sure we cover some of those topics, Paul, because when you talk about your acronym is so good: fresh thinking, inquisitive, real, expressive, direct. I think we all want that, and I've been in leadership positions at a high level in Fortune 100 companies myself, and those people that especially that directness, right? Sometimes the truth is not something everyone wants to hear, and maybe it's in the way we communicate it, right? Expressive and challenging. Sometimes when we as leaders have a great idea and somebody challenges that idea, and if we've been working on it. So what are some of the pitfalls that leaders are falling into that's causing them to get fired? And then even more importantly, what's causing leaders at high levels of organizations to fire the wrong people? And what can they do? What is it that Paul Mac, that you found out in all the research you've done, that would maybe prevent us from getting rid of those dynamic, direct, challenging, and very effective leaders that we need for the future, and then we're getting rid of them instead of keeping them and nurturing them?
Yeah, equally, there's a lot in there in what you've just said, and I think some words come up for me which are fear. So organizations fear different approaches to leadership, but one of the things that I wanted to just back up, and I don't think I've reiterated it so far in our conversation, but there is a perception of leaders who have these qualities that they are troublemakers. And one of the things that my work does is to showcase how leaders who have these qualities, who are disruptive as their leadership style and the way they approach leadership, is that they're driven by something bigger than an ego, a title, or their own success. They're driven by the purpose of the organization. So one of the things that motivates them is how what they're doing contributes to the future ability of the organization to realize its mission. So this is something that's very misunderstood with leaders who have disruptive leadership capabilities like fired leaders, because everyone assumes that they're ego driven and they're in it for themselves and their own agenda. But I write quite extensively about this in my work and in my first of 3 books, that these leaders are driven by something different than your average leader. So I think some of the pitfalls that leaders who have these qualities step onto and fall into are often what their leadership style, their leadership approach is highlighting dysfunction within the organization. So it's highlighting what's not working in an organization. Let me give you an example, Dan. How many times have your listeners or you been in a meeting where someone says to you, the boss says to you, Dan, what do you think about this idea? I want your honest opinion. What do you think of this idea, this project, this way to generate revenue, or this new service offering idea? And Dan, you're a fired leader, right? So you're driven by being honest, being open, being transparent, being very clear. And by the way, the expressive and challenging trait, when I did some research for it in the book, leaders who have that quality, they actually save a significant amount of money in the organization, because they get to the point quickly, they cut through the crap, and they're very clear and concise with conveying what they mean and it being understood by the recipient. So back to my skip. So you're asked your opinion in a meeting, but the person that asks you your opinion is your boss. Now, here's what happens with a fired leader. A fired leader is driven by the mission and the overall purpose of the organization. So they are motivated by giving the answer that's going to help the organization drive towards that successful realization of the mission.
Right.
They're not driven by the egos in the room. They're not driven by worrying about, well, if I say something that's the antithesis of what my boss wants to hear, I'm not going to get promoted. Right. Now, here's where the majority of leaders in the majority of organizations that I've worked with, and I've supported thousands of leaders as a consultant and, you know, worked with hundreds of organizations as clients. Here's what the majority of leaders do in that situation. They defer to what I call leadership groupthink, and they don't challenge the idea for that at that bigger level, the elevation of consciousness at that leadership level to help the organization. They defer to the egos in the room, stroke the ego of the most senior person, and that's a complete waste of time, resources, and brains. But that's what's happening in organizations right now as we speak. Now, fired leaders, they don't play that game, because remember, they don't play the political game. They're not interested in moving the pieces around the chessboard. Others can call politics influence or persuasion by another name, but really what it is it contributes to the almost $400 billion every year in disengagement within the workforce globally. So that's one major pitfall that leaders who have these qualities can fall into, Dan.
Right. That makes makes so much sense, Paul. You know, here's you know, as you were saying that, I thought of the story of the emperor and having no clothes.
Yeah.
You know, if we don't have fired leaders, and you are the senior person in the room, and everybody is afraid to tell you that, hey, this idea is a bad idea, or this idea isn't going to work with our clients, or whatever the feedback, that important feedback that you need. I think you come back to creating psychological safety so that those fired leaders can be authentic and expressive and challenging in response to that very important question. Because how often, and I've sat in those meetings, Paul, where you're asked, well, what do you think of the idea? But they don't really want to know what you think of the idea.
Yeah.
They want you to tell them how great the idea is.
Yeah, and that's and you know, I'm glad you mentioned the Emperor's New Clothes, because actually part of one of the chapters in my book about the D trait, direct and transparent, it tells a story of the Emperor's New Clothes, because we for that purpose, precisely for that purpose, because there is a lot of noise and a lot of fluff and a lot of ineffective processes and systems and approaches in today's approach to leadership. And so what leaders who have these disruptive leadership capabilities do, they drive through that and they simplify. And you know, it's interesting you mentioned psychological safety. I'm a big fan of Amy Edmondson's work in this area. One of the things that is not necessarily known about leaders who have disruptive leadership capabilities is because they're real and accountable, they often create the conditions for trust within organizations. Right. And they are expecting of and recipients of and contribute to those honest-based conversations. So because they're purpose-driven, and we know this from pre-pandemic, EY came out with some research. I think it was 96% of leaders whose purpose does not align to the organizations, so their individual purpose doesn't align to the organizations, will not join or stay in your organization. Now, that was pre-pandemic, Dan. So my work shows that leaders who have these disruptive leadership qualities, A, are driven by something bigger than themselves. B, because of that, their sense of authenticity and being genuine, it's contagious. So they're surrounded by others who are peers, and who they work with, by people that want to replicate that culture, that approach, that genuine sense of being yourself at work. And I don't mean, you know, playing foosball or sitting on a beanbag and drinking alcohol at 5 o'clock on a Friday and being real that way. What I mean is, if you ask me a question, I'm going to give you an honest answer, but know that the honest answer is driven by something bigger, a bigger quest to help the organization, which can have all sorts of financial advantages as well as talent advantages in the recruitment space. So yeah, it's what's missing, I think, from a lot of organizations recognizing the value that these leaders can bring. And this is where listeners may need to lean in. It's you. So it's the lack of self-awareness and ability to self-reflect, and the lack of openness to see these leaders through a different lens. And so we talked backstage about this, in terms of like the types of organizations and clients that we like working with. I only work with organizations that are starting to wake up to the true extent of why organizations have been quite dysfunctional and institutionally ineffective, and where leaders with these qualities can actually make a true difference to the impact of your team, organization, industry that they choose to serve. And so the pitfall, unfortunately, no one can bring you to the mirror and make you fully self-reflect and self-aware. It's something that you've got to be open to. And I'm finding a lot of organizations that are progressive in their thinking are becoming more open to a different kind of leader than the typical cut and paste approach that we've had to leadership up until now.
Yeah, you bring up I want to make sure we cover your values, because you shared those with us, and you start with authenticity. And I think that's something that when we sit in those meetings where we're trying to be political, the authenticity is missing. So if you lead with authenticity, let's just be our authentic self. Let's have psychological safety so that every opinion is seen, heard, and understood. So we listen to understand, we listen to help, rather than to listen with the intent to answer and come up with the right answer. I think that's so important. Your second value is curiosity. And again, I think that speaks to, you can't challenge the status quo if you're not curious, right? If you're just going to accept what gets brought down, whatever the corporate line is, if you're just going to accept that and say, okay, that's what we're going to do because that's what politically is going to make me safe, then we're not going to get the results. You mentioned something that I think is really important, Paul, the positive financial impact of fired leaders. And you've obviously done some research on this. So for our leaders on the call, or for our coaches who coach leaders on the call, tell us a little bit about the financial benefits of having a culture where we can use that D in fired and be direct and transparent.
Yeah, but one obvious cost to embracing leaders who have these qualities is that it reduces your leadership turnover costs. So I've talked about this quite publicly as well over the last few years. Every leader who leaves your organization costs a direct financial cost between 213 and 400% of their base salary. And so that doesn't include indirect financial costs, and it also doesn't include other financial costs such as benefits and pensions, as well as any litigation. But I'm more interested in the indirect financial costs, the impact on morale, productivity, trust levels, the impact on clients that you leave behind. Do those clients leave as well when you leave? So there are all sorts of unquantified costs that we don't yet know the true value of. And I write very clearly in my work that if we are open to shifting the way that we perceive leaders who have these qualities, and by the way, in my book, I define each fired quality. I give an overview of it. I talk about the behaviors of these kinds of leaders, how to coach for these qualities, how to measure them, how to recruit for them. And so I really want to make it as simple as possible for anyone interested in taking this work into their organization to do so. And so I'm very clear that if and the research is very clear, if we change the way we see these leaders, then we'll reduce turnover, we'll increase the effectiveness of interactions and communications between leaders, between team members and leaders, with clients and leaders.
But I also think in terms of it's linked to turnover. That when we start to normalize these kinds of qualities, we're evolving the leadership culture and the way that leaders turn up. And so when we have a truly safe environment where people can be transparent, they can be courageous, and these are normalized, what we start to find is that people want to stay in the organization. So your retention levels increase as well. Again, there's a whole swath of research that talks about organizations that make bad hiring decisions every year. That's quite costly. I think it was PwC that did that research. It's quite costly. My challenge and my invitation to organizations, because I can't remember the exact number down, but a significant number of organizations every year admit that they make bad hiring decisions. What if those bad hiring decisions were simply misunderstanding the qualities that are being displayed by leaders and non-leaders, by the way? The fired qualities aren't just about for people in leadership positions. That they're agnostic in one sense. I just started it because it was my experience and the platform that I started from. But I'm also aiming to get the fired leadership qualities, in fact, the fired qualities, into the way that we identify and recruit broader based talent as well. But I'm curious what we would save in terms of recruitment costs and bad hire decisions if we saw these qualities through a different lens.
Yeah, that there's a couple of things that you bring up there, and as leaders, we have a responsibility also to run an organization. And so I think the question that comes to mind is when you're dealing with fired leaders, those willing to challenge the status quo and give us direct feedback, there's got to be a fine line too, where, hey, maybe that's a little bit too honest or a little bit too direct. So I think we've all experienced that person that just says what's on their mind, and maybe not at the appropriate time, right? So there's a time and a place for those things. So what advice do you have for somebody who's leading? Because because we've all had them in our organizations, those people who are maybe too direct, and they don't care whose feelings they hurt, as long as they're getting their message across. So how do we allow for that communication, that honest communication to happen, but do it in a way that is done in a caring manner, so that we're not losing? Because you can have a great leader who's very direct and gets things done, but he's got turnover issues himself as a leader. So how do we encourage that leader to be who they are, be direct and be authentic, but also take into account the fact that, hey, at the end of the day, we're dealing with humans and people with feelings, right? So then we don't always want that especially, if the baby's ugly, we don't always want to hear that the baby's ugly in those terms, right in front of everyone else. So I'm sure you've dealt with this. Tell us about that, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I would gently challenge you in that sense, and the reason I'll challenge is because if we say that we want a transparent organization and an honest culture, then there's no half-hearting that. You can't say that, okay, we don't like the way you said it this way. Can you just censor it? Can you dilute it? So firstly, I think that's an incongruence for me when if I'm talking to an organization, and in fact there are examples, so I won't name the clients, but there are organizations that said to me, we love what you're doing, we just don't like the word fired. And so that to me also highlights quite publicly there's a stigma. There's a taboo. It's a taboo topic to talk about the concept of being fired. Well, partly my work aims to address that, because what I'm saying, and it's clearly woven through with evidence-based research and case studies and interviews. So it's not just one guy talking about this. I've spent 5 years on this path. What I'm deliberately saying, those challenges, those people that you find irritating, they've been misunderstood up until now. The fact that it makes you feel uncomfortable as an organization, that's part of the conversation that we need to have in order to normalize and embrace a different kind of leadership, leaders who lead different. You can't, when you comment about the baby, nobody wants to hear the baby's ugly. Well, they pretty much do if down the line you could have saved them 5 million cost going out of the business. Well, they would have preferred to hear it then. Maybe you could have said, well, your baby's facially challenged. You could have softened it, right? But still, you're not being truthful. Yeah. And so for me, it's about creating a culture where truth tellers, disruptive truth tellers, are valued for the bigger purpose. So one thing, if I haven't made it very clear in this conversation, it's very clear in my work in the book. Fired leaders are elevating your approach to leadership, right? And they're doing so by publicly highlighting that you have a shame factor about being fired, right? But once you move that to the side, then you start to realize, actually, these 5 qualities are missing from the way we do leadership, and look at the advantages of them. So I guess I want to contextualize my answer in that context, because there's, it's almost like saying, well, I use an example with the direct and transparent in my book. When people say to me, you're naive, Paul, for thinking that you'll ever eradicate politics in the workplace, I say to them, but the organization and the culture of the organization is determined by you, the people. So every morning when you wake up, you have a choice. Just like when you brush your teeth, you also have a choice. Do I want to play the political game today? Am I prepared to play the game that's costing me so much else? So turnover, morale, productivity. We haven't even talked about mental health and the effect of well-being, but all of these costs are directly and indirectly attributable to playing a political game that we feel that we've inherited and must play. The future organization, Frederick Laloux talks about in reinventing organizations and other work of that nature, that there is going also to be a different approach to the way we structure organizations. So those that are not already waking up to the fact that the old way of designing organizations is gone, it's just like the same approach to draconian-based leadership. That was a thing at one point. It's not a thing now, or if it is, it's not. Staff and leaders aren't staying in organizations like that. So I know I'm probably going off track a little bit, but I wanted to highlight the fact that you can't necessarily, you can dip your toe in, but you can't necessarily say, I've had enough now. Can you change everything to suit my level of comfort in the organization? It's like, no, sorry. If one more point, and then I'll be quiet. There is a difference between being a fired leader and being a jerk. And what I mean by that is, I know we've all had those people in our organization who just wants to say what's on their mind and just be a troublemaker for the sake of it. And I spend quite a bit of time in my book and my work talking up front to say, they're not fired leaders. They're not the leaders I'm talking about. They are trying to meddle and almost put in place a toxic culture. They're not purpose driven. They're not motivated by something bigger than themselves. They're motivated by ego. They're motivated by jealousy. They're motivated by bitterness. They didn't get the promotion, or they didn't get the budget for their division, so they're going to put a spanner in the works. They're not fired leaders because they don't embrace the holistic nature of what being a leader is. So I make it very clear that these are not fired leaders. And controversial as it may be, even people like Elon Musk and Steve Jobs, as brilliant as they were and are, they embody some of the qualities of fired leaders, but in others they don't. So they're not what I would call a fired leader. So yeah, no, it's an interesting one. It's almost like I'll have half of that, but this part that is too raw and touches too many nerves, I don't want it. You see, that's partly why we've had such systemic dysfunction. It's because we get to a point we're courageous enough, and then we get too fearful. I said when I answered this question, fear. It all comes down to fear.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So I think what you're saying, Paul, is look, if you're going to implement the fired leadership approach, You got to go all in. There is no
Yeah.
dipping your toes. There is, hey, we're all in. We're all big boys and girls here, and we're going to talk honestly. We're going to be direct. We're going to be authentic. We're going to give feedback when it's necessary, and we're going to have psychological safety so that those fired leaders don't feel like, hey, that's enough honesty out of you, Paul. Now it's time for you to go, right? That's enough
Yeah.
authenticity from you.
And I think, and I think it's part of committing. If I again look at the statistics, the research out there, I think it's over 52%. DDI, the largest leadership think tank in the world, I think it's over 52% of organizations don't have a leadership strategy.
Mhm.
But of those that do, almost half of them are better at identifying, getting the right leaders in place and having those leaders stay and be productive and deliver value. So doesn't it make sense that all organizations need to think about having a leadership strategy? My point being there is, if you're going to go all in and evolve your approach to the future of leadership, you have to go all in. You have to have the honest conversations that you haven't wanted to have, the things that you've kept in the corner of the room that have been too painful. Like, for instance, I know that we're not going to talk too much about this, but exit interviews. Why is it that there's a surface level commitment to doing exit interviews when someone leaves, leader or not, but then the data from those exit interviews is hardly ever used?
Mm-hmm.
My challenge is an invitation is to do those exit interviews and see what data surfaces. And that's your issue as an organization. And that's the thing that you need to address, because if you don't address it, it will just keep happening and happening. And generally, spoiler alert, the exit interview data generally says, I didn't like working with that individual because of that reason. And that's the thing that we don't talk about in organizations. So we talk about psychological safety, yet people leave and explain the real reason why they left, and nothing's done with it. So my approach is really, guys, girls, we can't half-ass this anymore, pardon my French. We've got to commit to embracing a different leadership culture, strategy, and approach. And then we'll start to see the impact that these leaders can have once they're cultivated and embraced within the organization that they serve. And by the way, they choose to serve. And that's a really important point I've made. They choose to be in the organization despite being misunderstood.
No, I love that you're saying that, and I think one of the things that you've said over and over, and I think we can't emphasize it enough, fired leaders have to have, they have to almost be have that contributor trait. They want to make a difference. They believe in the bigger cause, and they have to be people centered. And you talk about that. We talk about that in the introduction. So if you have all the qualities, but you don't care about people, then you're not a fired leader. Right?
No, and also, Dan, leaders who have these qualities are very clear on their why.
Right.
They're very clear, and they don't play the game, because to them the game is an impediment to their why. And their why is to really do things differently to help. We're not just talking about to help an organization be profitable. Sure, that's a byproduct. What we're talking about is to help industries evolve, to help GDPs of countries to evolve, to generate future economies, and future leaders who aren't even born, that never have to live and work in the context that a lot of us have. So they're in it for a bigger. Their why is a lot bigger.
That is so good. So Paul, before we go, I want to make sure we talk about the book, The Fired Leader. I mean, hey, you put this all into a book, The Fired Leader, Reinventing the Future of Leadership, from Paul McCarthy. Where can people find the book? It sounds to me like you almost have to read the book before you work with Paul, or if you're going to be, I know you've got a user's guide and everything that comes with it. Tell us about the book. Where can people get it? And then also, how can people get a hold of you if they're interested in becoming fired leaders or implementing your process, your system into what they're doing in their companies?
Yeah, thank you. I think, obviously wherever you buy your books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, that, there are all sorts of outlets, and you can find them on my LinkedIn profile. I'm sure we'll drop some stuff in show notes as well, some links and things like that. For me, the book is a platform. It's a conversation starter, and the first part of the book is deliberately designed in a way that no other, in fact, there is no other book like this. And a lot of people think that they've had books that are like this, but this book really is quite different. Over 50 people have endorsed it, have said the same. The first part talks about what's wrong today with leadership, not from a blame perspective, not from a judgment perspective, but just to build people's awareness and awakening to the conversation that we really need to have, which is part 2 of the book. And that's to say, we need a different approach to how we identify, recruit, onboard, and develop leaders. And I go through each of the fired qualities. I talk about the fired leadership methodology, the framework. I talk about the behaviors of leaders who have these different qualities, how to define them, how to recruit for them, how to coach for them. I give you some kind of guidance at the end for things to think about if you want to have leaders like this in your organization. And part 3 starts to kind of toe dip into, and the only reason I haven't included a longer section in part 3 is because my publisher couldn't actually put what I wanted in the final part. So what I've done is made the final part of my book available through my website, and it is a companion guide, which is to say, if you like what you see, if you like what you read, and you don't want to speak to me, that's completely fine. I want to open source the future of leadership. So for me, you go to my website, just give me your email, there'll be no spam, I promise. Then you can download a $3 million companion guide, which actually gives you an end-to-end roadmap of over 30 activities to say, right, doesn't matter how mature my organization is or how mature I am as a leader to take this stuff in. You can start with any of these activities wherever your readiness and maturity levels are, and say, right, just do one thing from this roadmap and see how it resonates. So I've deliberately designed something that isn't just an academic navel-gazing book that is designed to bring you to my expensive website to funnel you to in my pipeline. So I sell you lots of services. Of course, I'm a capitalist with conscience, and I speak and I do programs and all that sort of stuff. But I genuinely, Dan, want people to do as much as they can with as much as I could give them. So I've given away this $3 million companion guide for free. I think for the month of July and August, the book is 99 cents on Kindle as well, and we can provide the relevant show notes for that. But I genuinely want to impact as many people as possible with this book and the philosophy, the mindset, and the approach that underpins it. It's a very different kind of book. And I say very publicly, the world does not need another leadership book. What it needs is a conversation about what's not working, why it's not worked, and what are we going to do differently going forward. And that's why I wrote this book. That's my why.
I love what you're saying there, Paul. And I can feel the passion. I can feel you're fired up about this. I love the acronym Fired Leader. There's so many ways we can go with it. At Why Not Leadership, we're all about leading different. This is definitely a different approach, a new approach, something that's very much needed in the industry. So I'd like to close with this question, Paul. Let's talk about your why not moment. So Why Not Leadership is all about leading different and doing things that others won't do. One of the things that one of the ways I like to explain it, at the end of our life, we're not going to regret the things we did. What you did, you did. You're not going to regret that you didn't do it. But the things that we're going to regret is what you didn't do. So I like to ask the question, tell us about your biggest why not moment. What's a time in your life when you said, why not? To an opportunity, a job, a new venture, and you're so glad you did it. As you look back now, what's that why not moment for you?
Well, I think I mean it's an obvious answer for me. It's what I'm doing. It's what I'm doing now. So I started this quest 5 years ago, and I intentionally did not try to commercialize because I wanted to drip feed different ideas and narratives into the world to see how they resonated with people. I wanted to know if the time was now to have a different conversation about the future of leadership. Now, let me just set the context for how challenging this really is in real life, because I'm not a fraudulent guru. I'm not a fake thought leader. I'm the real deal, and I've got a conversation that I want to have with the world. And amidst all of this, I had friends, I had romantic partners, I had family members alienate themselves from me, walk away from me, because they thought I was just one guy who was bitter about being fired. and just wanted to talk about that with the world. I had some vendors who I worked with initially who thought that I was writing a book about showcasing the organizations that had fired me. So they wanted to put me on shows like Oprah, and not Oprah herself, I don't think, but to showcase and, almost sensationalize it. And all the way through, despite all of that kind of critique and trolling and almost trying to dissuade me from doing this, I have always been driven by the conversation that I want to have to say, if one person benefits from this, then I have been successful, because I know the way we've done it hasn't worked. And I would chuckle, at myself and others when they thought I was just writing a book about being fired and what did I know and who was I. I was like, I'm really trying to elevate the game of leadership and talk to people on a different level. So that's my why not moment, because when everybody was saying, well, why would you do that? And I would say, well, why not? Right? We thought the world was flat once. Okay. Right. So if people didn't forage and explore, we'd still have that naive, myopic viewpoint. And I've just come along, and 5 years ago, and again, I'll be quiet, I promise. 5 years ago when I started this path, the learning and development, the leadership development, the industry, the training industry, quite literally wanted my head on a spike, because I was saying things that were uncomfortable for them to hear. They weren't quite ready. 5 years later, we've had some of the world's most prolific thought leaders in leadership, disruption, culture, self-development, industry, and the HR industry endorse this book. Now, that to me is quite humbling and a very proud moment. And so it wouldn't have happened if I said, well, why not?
Right. Wow. Thank you so much, Paul. This has been Paul Mack. This has been a great interview. Why Not Leaders? Please go to Amazon and take a look at The Fired Leader. Go to Paul's website. It's the thefiredleader.com, I believe. And so just
is that, yeah, so you can actually find me on paulmackleadership.com.
paulmackleadership.com. And so let's go there so we can learn more about Paul. He's got a great website. There's videos on it. He's got some of the resources that he talked about here. Paul, this has been really, really informative. I've really enjoyed our conversation, enjoyed taking you through your why discovery prior to the show. So thank you for being on. And what do you say we end the show on that note?
Why not?
Thank you so much, Paul. Hey, right on cue. Thank you so much. Why Not Leaders? We'll see you next week on the next episode of the Lead Different podcast. But for now, let's say goodbye to Paul Mack, and don't forget to continue to lead different.
Thank you.
This is Lead Different.
Subscribe now. Discover a new era of leadership. Lead different, because great leaders change the world.